That's the thing. I mean, they want everything that we publish to be ADA compliant, even if it is a class recording and no one in class, has expressed a need for ADA, assistive technology.
Easy way to get around that on your syllabus quiz. You could probably just put something on there acknowledging that you do not need any ADA.
That's not gonna fly with the district. I cannot waive it. They want everything to be ADA compliant. They want to blanket everything.
Right.
So in order not to get into trouble with ADA compliance, the only way that I can do to comply to that is not to have any type of class recording. Even when there's no one in class that needs ADA assistive technology or closed captioning. Yep. Well, that's where things are heading. Okay, I'm being a little bit resistive over here. All right. So getting back to this class, your homework assignment. So how many people have gotten started with your homework assignment? Very good. So what I want to do is to show you what it's supposed to look like when it's all done. So I got it done. Let's just say recently, and I can show you what it looks like. Oh, no, I did not use this account. I used my Dr. Tech account, so let me log in to that account first. No, it's not the Sun Profs. I have to add it.
You can't share projects between accounts easily. It would be nice if they implemented a way where you could share files between accounts easily.
Yeah, that would be nice.
You're using Google as their backend, so I would think,
Oh, no. Don't do it now. Do it later. Go away. I have to edit that part out now. Because otherwise... Yep.
Have you ever, when you're in App Inventor, you can open up like 2 different projects, it just keeps giving you like a message though that you can have problems.
Yeah.
I've been just doing that and kind of just ignoring it.
What kind of problem?
Do you remember? Because I ignored it so much.
Okay, if it keeps bugging you and you cannot move forward to do your homework, you send an AIA file to me and see if I can reproduce the problem.
Oh yeah, it doesn't let you have the account open in 2 different locations.
Yeah.
I started to use like screenshots too, just to have that open.
Okay.
Just work around it.
It doesn't let you have it open in 2 different places?
No.
So what if you have a second computer by any chance?
I've done it.
You might want to create another Gmail account, and that'll work.
Do that. Yeah, maybe that works, but it's not the same.
It's not the same.
Exactly. Perhaps they'll better be the only copy.
Because that's all I'm doing.
Okay, so I'm just waiting for the emulator to start up, because I got the project done already, without any sound effect or visual effect. It just got the basic stuff done. But I can tell you what you will need to use in order to get this homework assignment done. So that's the purpose of going through this. Yep. Oh, okay. Yes, it's freshly printed today, so that's why I had to go back and get it. Yep, so there's the row sheet.
You print it off or forget it if you just did Google Sheets.
That's okay. So technically speaking, App Inventor would also fall into that category because you are doing your homework assignment over there. Even though I'm not going there to grade your homework assignment, that can still be kind of like a borderline kind of thing. Sorry?
When is this homework due?
This homework is due on Monday, next Monday. So we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the... So I will give you the dots, okay? So you guys will have to kind of make the connections between the dots. All right, so it's starting up, getting there. Can you imagine how slow this gets, on my office computer with 2 gigs of RAM and a Core 2 dual processor?
You actually do it on there?
Yeah, I was able to run everything, okay, AI2 and the emulator and LibreOffice at the same time, which is kind of like a somewhat tight fit. Okay, so let's go ahead and just kind of move this dot around. This part is the same as last time. Okay, so I'll just we'll make a little figure 8 here. And when it's moving, I can click anywhere on the screen, and there's a cockroach and a spider. That's it. Okay, that's what you're supposed to do. Okay, you can choose any images that is not offensive, at least not to me. Sorry. So anything that is not offensive to me, it's okay. But I just use a spider. I launch a spider to get a cockroach. So because I know most people, many people do not want to deal with like military stuff. So that's okay. I can understand that. But most people have no problems killing cockroaches. Yeah. So you can replace the spider with a slipper. The flip flop. Like, make that sound.
Trojan and something
Troy.
representing like an antivirus or something.
Yeah, you can do that too. So anyway, that's what you're supposed to do. Let me just do it again so that you know what it's supposed to do. So you can plan the path just like before. When the arrow is moving, you can click anywhere in the canvas, and the spider will launch from the drone or the arrow at that point, and it will approach the cockroach. Okay. Now they may not touch eventually. Okay, but at least these two icons or these two sprites will be quote unquote colliding. Now there's a trick to this whole thing. Okay, because when the spider is first launched from the arrow, it will be colliding with the arrow. Okay, so if you do not check what it is colliding with, the spider may not move at all. So you have to check what it is colliding with in order to say, oh, if it's colliding with just the arrow, it's okay, it's not a problem, because that's where you came from. But if it is colliding with the cockroach, in this case, then you will say, oh, okay, I need to stop now because I have reached the target. Okay, so I'm going to show you the tricks to do this, not showing you the blocks of this particular program, but I'll show you the tricks in general how to do that. Okay, are there any other questions? No other questions? So we'll go ahead and get started with the alternative project, to show you how you can detect which sprite you're colliding with. Okay. So let's go ahead and start a new project, just for that purpose. Okay. I'll just call that collide, and at the end of the class, you can ask me to upload this project just so that you have the source code of all of this stuff here. So with this, I'll just make it as minimalist as possible. I will drag a canvas, change the canvas to just basically the same thing that we do. Yeah, 300. I can make it fill parents too because I don't really need anything else in this case. But I'll just make it the same as your project. In this case, I will drag like a few ball sprites. Doesn't have to be image sprite because the technique also works on ball sprites. So now we have 3 ball sprites, 1, 2, and 3, and I can just make them go in random directions. Okay, it's probably helpful to change the color of these so I can refer to each one as according to its color. So I will make one green and make the other one red, let's say, and then the other one just black. Okay, so now I can refer to these things by the color. All right. So what I can do is I can make them go in random directions, okay, more or less. Sorry? Say again? Oh.
You should rename them that way.
Well, enable is always there. It's always enabled. As soon as...
Rename the color. Rename it to like ball 1. It's black.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So we can rename ball 1 to black. Ball
Get really confused really quickly.
Sorry?
You would get really confused really quickly just working with code.
Yeah. And I have to go back and forth to find out which one is which one. Alright, so this one is green. Alright. So the next thing I want to do is to make them collide, okay? And I want to be able to tell, which one am I colliding with. So we'll go ahead and line up, these things here. So if I move the black one, it will first collide with the red one, and then will collide with the green one. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do this part using our blocks. Go. So in the blocks, the only thing I need to do is to start the motion. I probably want to reinitialize. Be able to reinitialize. Well, I don't need to.
It's easier.
I can just use a touch to reinitialize it. That's fine. So I go to blocks, and I will use the canvas touchdown event to move the black ball to a position, and then start to move it around. Okay. So touchdown of canvas is going to do a few things. The first thing it's going to do is to move the black ball. Yep.
I have a certain question about the project.
Yep.
Does the projectile sprite have to point in the direction of the target?
Yes, because the heading has to go in that direction. So
Alright.
you pretty much have to change once you change the heading, the direction will be changed accordingly. Yep. Alright, so the first thing I do is to move the black ball to wherever I touch on the screen so I can reset the whole thing. And then the second thing I do is, for the black ball to start moving. So I would say, black ball, specify its heading first. So I will make it point in a certain direction, but it's not going to use the point in direction. I'll point it to a particular target. And that target turns out to be, one of the balls. So I have to find out which one is the further. The green one is the further one. So I will make the black ball point to the green ball. So I click on green ball, and this is the trick here. This is one of the tricks that you have to learn, is to use the object itself, use the component, the green ball itself, to fill one of these slots. Okay, so that can be done. So once I change the direction, now I can specify a speed, so it would actually start moving. The tick is happening anyway. Okay, it's already ticking at 10 times per second, because it's already enabled. But it's not moving only because the speed is 0.0 initially. So as soon as I change the speed to non-zero, it will start to move in the direction that it's pointing to. So that means if I go to the black ball and I set the speed to something that is non-zero, then it will start to move. And depending on how the magnitude of this speed here, it will change how quickly it gets to the destination. So in this case, I will set it to, let's say, 10 pixels per update, and let's see what happens here. Okay, it doesn't have any bouncing and stopping ability right now, which I can add later. So I go back to the emulator, and it has not been updated. Either that or it has crashed. Yep. Okay. Reset. And redo it. The bottom line is, when you are colliding with something in the collision event handler, you can actually compare what is colliding with this sprite with the sprites that you have. So you can check whether the object you're colliding with is ball black, ball green, or ball red. That can be checked. The equality actually works. Okay, so that's how you can tell whether I'm colliding with a cockroach, because that's the only time the spider has to stop. If it's colliding with the arrow, it's not supposed to stop it, just keep going. Okay. So hopefully, this time the emulator will work correctly, and we can actually start this experiment. Okay, so this time we got the 3 balls, and I have to be careful where to start the black one. So it collides with the red one and then the green one. Well, that by itself is already a pretty good game, because the balls are kind of small, it's hard to aim. And it's actually still moving down here, because even though the y-axis is already at its limit, the x-axis is not. But once you get to the edge here, then it's going to stop. Okay. All right, so what we'll do is just repeat this a few times. It's just kind of fun to watch. There we go. Okay, now we want to change the code. Okay, so now we want to change the code and say what if the black ball is colliding with something? Let's do something depending on what it's colliding with. So you go to the black ball and you pick up the collided with event handler, and I'll just stash it over here. And you can see that this particular event handler has a parameter, other. Sorry?
Are you gonna put an if block in there?
Yep, you can put a conditional block in here. So you go to control, and then you put a conditional block in here. And let's just say that we want to do something different depending on which sprite is colliding with. So we'll go ahead and specify, if and then an else if, because I only want to check versus the green ball versus the red ball. Okay. So here's the trick. You go to math, okay, and you get the equality block here. And then you can also go to math and get the other one here. You specify other, which is the parameter of collided with, as one thing on the equality check. And then the other thing that you want to use is basically the component itself of the red ball. So I put the red ball here. And because you can see that it actually snaps, it means you can do it. Okay, it is actually valid. And then the other one I would use a green ball here. So I would put a green ball here. So this block of code will only execute if the black ball is colliding with the red ball. This block will only execute if it is colliding with a green ball. Okay, so let's go ahead and check to see if this works. Okay, one thing we can do is when it collides, we'll do something about the background color. Okay, yep, go ahead.
Because it's a single equal symbol, it just sets it to the red ball or green ball. Right?
No, it's in this case this is still comparison. It's still a check. Yep. So what we'll do is we'll change the background color of the canvas accordingly. If it collides with the red one, we'll change the color to maybe pink or something like that. So we'll go to canvas and change its background color. Change your background color to, and we'll go to colors and pick something that is on the red side, or we can make up our own color, which is kind of fun. So we'll just go ahead and make up our own color. All right. When you make your own color, it's red, RGB, red, green, and blue. So if you specify 255, it is just red, okay? If you specify 255, 255, 255, it is white. So what we'll do is we'll specify something that is close to red but not entirely, so that it's not saturate the whole screen, so we cannot see the ball itself. So we'll make it say 200, and then the other number will be 200 as well. And then when it collides with the green ball, we'll change the background color to kind of greenish. Okay, so we'll duplicate this block here, put it here, and you'll change the number so the RGB, so the middle one is going to be 255, and then the other ones will be slightly less than 255 here, so it becomes kind of like a green hue on a mostly white background. Okay, or at least that's what I think it's going to do. So we'll go ahead and start this one. Pink, green, so it all worked. So this is just a quick verification of that code does work. Okay, you can check what is colliding with a particular sprite. Okay, are there any questions about the code that I just talked about? Any questions about how it applies to your project? Okay, because if you don't check, then the first thing it collides with is most likely the arrow itself, because it comes from the same location. So that's why you have to make sure that you change it so that it only does something, only stops when it's colliding with the cockroach, in my case, the target. All right. Any other questions about this part? No questions? Okay. The other thing that you might have to do is you have to this one I'm done with this one, so let me go back to my projects, and I will download Tracker again because I have to point out something in Tracker that you might need to pay attention to for this homework assignment. So we'll go back to the Tracker, the original Tracker code, which is Tracker done. Because you can use my code as a starting point in this particular homework assignment. And I'll go back to App Inventor, upload that one. rename it.
Maybe
So
we'll check mark
select.
it. Yeah, actually. You have
Nope.
to rename it on the
Just
computer.
save it as.
Yeah.
Well, I can rename the other one before I upload it. I just feel that this is actually faster than going through the GUI.
Yeah.
I'll just call it tracker1.aia. Then I go back to here, do another import. This time I choose tracker1 without the parentheses, which is our original tracker program that you can use as a starting point. Okay, so now that this one is loaded, I'll just go ahead and double check the functionality. I haven't really done anything to this one, so it should be the same as last time, same as Monday. So I move the ball around a little bit. The arrow would basically draw itself accordingly. And that's all it does. Okay, so now that we have the original code, I can show you the blocks where things can be a little bit messy, okay? The problem has to do with when canvas 1 is touched, we want to clear the screen. So let's see if that actually works. Okay, touch the screen and it does clear. Okay, now the question is, I also want the touch event to specify where the target is and start the launching of the spider in the other program. So that means this event handler is now dual purposed. Yep.
If you get rid of the canvas one, got clear because it stops the sprite from moving along its path.
Yep, it stops it too. So what you will need to do is to make a conditional statement here, okay? In other words, what you need to do, I'm not going to give you the entire solution, you kind of have to think about it a little bit. So what you need to do is to put a conditional statement here and put this into one of the branches. And you will have an else branch to basically say, okay, there's something else that I might need to do when this condition is not true, okay? So basically what you want to put in here is the logic to put the cockroach target on the screen. First, make it appear, okay? So change hidden or change visible to true, and then also set the velocity of the spider, make the spider visible, and then make it start to move, okay? So that's the logic that belongs to the else branch. But so the question now is, how do you make the decision? Okay, am I just starting to draw a new path for the drone, or is it time for me to specify the target and have the spider, the projectile, to move toward the target? So go ahead.
You check to see if the sprite is hidden or not.
You can check to see whether the sprite is hidden or not. There are a few things that can give you that indication of whether this is a good time to do this or a good time to do the other thing. If you look at all the components, there are a few things you can use already in here. There is clock draw, okay? So if clock draw timer is still ticking, that means we are still moving the drone around. So at that time would be a good time to say, oh, okay, we are still moving the drone, so that means we can launch the projectile. So you can use the state of clock draw as a clue as to, okay, which way should I go? Now, in the end of drawing everything, you can see that clock draw is going to be disabled. So when clock draw is enabled, it is telling you that the drone is flying and we should set the target and move the projectile. When clock draw is disabled, or when the enable is false, that tells you that, okay, we are just waiting to start the next round. Okay, so when it is touched at that point, just clear the screen. So use the state of clock draw as a clue of which way you should go. Is that okay? Because without that logic, then it's ambiguous. Okay, when you touch somewhere on the screen, should it be cleared, or should I specify the target and have the spider to start moving to the target? So that's something that you will have to kind of think about. Minor things, just a reminder: when you use an image sprite, you have to change the orientation, to face east by default first, because facing east is 0 degrees So when you download the image, you have to basically rotate it so that it aligns to east when the bitmap is not doing a single thing, okay? Because that corresponds to 0 degrees in the sprite's heading, okay? Which is not too hard to do. I mean, you can even download something that is not even close to any of the northeast, southwest direction. I'll give you an idea of how to do this. So let's say we're looking for spiders. Is anyone afraid of spiders? Because if I'll just use an arrow, I'll use something that is neutral, and it always pops up the motion picture, always. So we'll pick an arrow that is not aligned, northeast, southwest. This one is probably a good one to pick. I'm going to pick this one. So I'm going to pick something that is, slanted, and like this one. Maybe this one is kind of slanted sufficiently, and we'll go ahead and save this file. Oh, it's an SVG. I can't do. Sorry.
You can change it to JPG.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, sure, why not?
Difference.
Sure, why not? There's a program called I cannot remember the name of it, but I can find it. It's called Inkscape. That's it.
Yeah.
Inkscape is a really, really cool program, for people who like to do this sort of thing. So I'm going to open up the file. And what is the name? Black arrow. There we go. And it opens it up, as a SVG file. Now, Inkscape is not the same as GIMP. GIMP is what we call a raster tool, which means it is designed to deal with images that are pixel by pixel by pixel by pixel. Okay, and it does a really good job with processing images and stuff like that. But when it comes to drawing something that is contiguous or continuous, Inkscape is much better. Now I can show you one thing about Inkscape that is really superior to the GIMP. With the GIMP, if you magnify a certain portion of an image, at some point you will start to see pixels. It will start to pixelate because that is the limitation of bitmaps, okay, of raster images. But when you're dealing with Inkscape, it is not like that, okay? It's not bitmap oriented. It is what we call vector graphics oriented. In other words, it stores the instruction to draw the arrow. It does not store the pixel information. So let me show you what you can do with Inkscape. You can use the magnification tool, and you can say, okay, magnify this portion, and magnify this portion, 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 this portion, and you can see that it is still completely smooth. That's because the way the arrow is encoded is not in pixels. It is encoded by instruction of how it should be drawn on screen. Okay, so that makes this a really great tool, or great way to represent images if you're dealing with poster size type of logos and whatnot. I mean, I'm sure some of you have to deal with logos and other things.
Stuff for applications.
Sorry?
Application design, which is that kind of work, because you don't know what the end target screen is going to be. And
Exactly.
It makes it nice for.
Yeah, so in a way it's kind of like PostScript or PDF, because it stores the instruction of how something to be drawn and not the pixel information. So given that this is really a great useful tool to kind of add to your arsenal of what you use for manipulating images and whatnot. Now the Inkscape has a really interesting feature. What if you start with a bitmap? Okay, so you have a bitmap of something, and you say, okay, but sometimes I want to blow it up to really, really big, okay, and I still want to preserve the image and not make it pixelate. The Inkscape is a feature to convert an image into SVG. And it does a pretty good job at it too. Okay, if you start with a fairly high resolution image, so that all the curves and all the points, and whatnot are represented, Inkscape can actually convert it into SVG format, so that it now becomes infinitely scalable. So that's a pretty good tool. I'm not going to teach you how to use Inkscape. That's a whole different kind of thing. But I just want to point out, this is a really cool tool to do, all kinds of stuff. Okay, so getting back to this one, I'm gonna zoom all the way out, just so that I can see the entire arrow. So now I select the entire arrow, and I click it one more time, and it becomes the rotation tool. So now I can just go ahead and rotate it until it looks about right. Okay, the other direction, because you want it to face east, not west. Okay, so now that it is facing east, I can go to, I can select just the thing that I want to export, and go to File, and then go to Export Bitmap. And because I just made the selection itself, that's why the selection tab is actually selected right now. I can now change the bitmap size, because I can kind of rescale everything to make it fit nicer. So if I want to make it a bitmap for my sprite, I can make this a lot smaller. In other words, I can make it let's say 80 pixels by 8 pixels. And then you click, you select the file name, you click export, and that file will be exported. Okay, so this is a really nifty tool for doing all sorts of stuff like this. Okay, you can even import an image, okay, a bitmap, into Inkscape, rotate the image, and then re-export it so that it is after the rotation. So you can do the rotation stuff in Inkscape and then re-export the bitmap. I've done that kind of stuff, quite a bit, and it turns out to be pretty useful. So are there any questions about the use of Inkscape? Have you guys seen the posters along the hallway of the BCS area? I use mostly Inkscape to make many of those posters. Yep. So it's a pretty useful tool. It takes a little bit of time to really know all of its features, but once you get used to the features, it's a really good tool. Right. So that takes care of the other issue that we were talking about. Any other questions about the project? Any difficulties that you guys have encountered?
I was having that problem that you went over where when I tried to shoot it didn't move, it just stayed there.
Because it is already colliding with something and it stops right away.
Yeah, so hopefully that'll work.
That will solve that problem. Yep. Okay, any other questions? No other questions? Okay. So if there are no other questions, we'll go back to the class website and we'll just kind of track down, what else, we haven't really talked about. I think I covered most of the stuff, that is on the website already. So what is remaining now is just questions that you might have for your projects. So any questions related to your projects?
I want a user to be able to enter a few bits of information and store it as a record.
Okay.
And be able to edit that record later.
Okay.
Or add to it. In your opinion, would that be something that I would do with TinyDB, or would I need a full SQL database, or?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so let me kind of repeat the question because I think the recorder may not have recorded your question. So the question is, you have an application where you want to store some kind of a record. So you have to kind of bundle a few things together and call that one single thing, and you want to be able to store that. So assuming you don't want to store it remotely online, and it can be local, so TinyDB would be a great place to put it. And I would also use the concept of a list to do it, because TinyDB can natively deal with a list. You don't even need JSON encoding to do it because it is built in to the TinyDB mechanism.
With TinyDB, would I also be able to tie other records to that record, like have notes that go along with that record that could be adjusted separately?
That is up to you. Okay. So in TinyDB, yes.
Okay.
So with TinyDB, the way you store something is it's called a key value pair, which means the quote unquote name of a item, which is also called a tag of an item, is kind of like an identifier, but it has to be unique within TinyDB. Okay, which kind of makes sense because you can only have one thing with that name. But what you want to associate with that name can be a number, can be a string, can be a list. And a list can be a list of lists and so on and so forth. So it can be very embedded. So within one of the fields of the list that you store with one particular item, it can have the name or the tag of another item in TinyDB. Okay, so you basically can use this to kind of chain up your items in TinyDB. Now it does get kind of complicated, because if you do it this way, it is kind of like that's the sort of thing that we talk about in data structures, in the data structure class, cisp362. But assuming it's not going to be anything that is too complicated, like you store, let's say, like people's name, in your as tags, and then you say, oh, the parent or the father of this person is the other name, then you can use TinyDB to store a record of the other name. So you can keep doing this until you are running out of names to store, basically.
And fusion tables.
Okay.
Would that also work for that type of thing, or is that for?
Fusion table is online. Okay, so let's go to Fusion table.
I've been trying to read about it, but I haven't really gotten very deep into it.
Yeah, Fusion table takes a little bit more effort to make it work.
But could it be used for the same thing?
It could.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a look at Fusion table. And with Fusion table, you need to set it up first. So if you just read the documentation, it's kind of involved.
Yeah, I've gotten that far setting up an actual fusion table.
Oh, you got that far?
Yeah, but I wasn't sure if it would do what I wanted, so I didn't get very far after that.
Okay. Well, one thing we can certainly do in this class is to drag it into the project and find out what you can do with it. And that's the nice thing about App Inventor is you don't have to look up a whole lot of documentation if you just want to kind of find out what is available. Because now that we have a Fusion table control, we can now take a look at what you can do with it. So you can do query, which is basically sending a it's deprecated, so you're not supposed to do that. Forget login. So basically, forget end user login credential has no effect on surface authentication. You can get rows. So get all the rows from a specified Fusion table. The table ID field is the ID of the required Fusion table. The columns field is a comma-separated list of the columns to retrieve. So basically, when you deal with Fusion table, it's just like a regular table. You have rows that goes horizontally, and then you have columns, or what we call, in this case, fields also, that goes vertically. So when you retrieve something from a Fusion table, you can specify, I don't need everything. I just need these particular columns. But give me all the rows, but only these columns with all those rows. You can also specify a condition. So get rows with conditions. So you can specify the conditions. And that part depends on how you can specify conditions with the Fusion table.
So the condition could be a date range.
Well, let's see. The condition fields specify what rows to retrieve from the table. For example, the rows in which a particular column value is not null. So I would assume that is a string that Fusion table can handle. So it's not something, so the conditions is not going to be using the math block. It's going to be something that is specific to the Fusion table syntax. You can insert row to a table. You can send a query of some kind. The rest are properties only. Yep. So basically, it's a very simple table, and it can certainly do the same thing as a TinyDB. If you think about it, all you have to do is to make a table with two columns. One column for the key, and then one column for the value. Then it becomes a remote TinyDB. But what you do not have in this case is the ability to store a list just by saying, oh, store this, this is a list, and store it. Because it doesn't make that association and say, okay, oh, this is a list, I need to use JSON encoding to store it, in the form of a string in the actual table. Because I don't think Fusion table has a built-in list type. I don't think so. So you have to use JSON encoding to do it. But we have the code for JSON encoding already, and then the decoding part can be done with a web component. So that's why it's not too hard. If you want to store an entire record this way, you just have to kind of plan for it. You have to have the JSON encoding subroutine in the code, and then you need a web component to do the decoding. Okay, that's a good question. All right, but let's go ahead and take a look at just TinyDB. Okay, how do we store a record into TinyDB and retrieve just that record? Okay, so I'm going to make a very simple application to do that. So let's go ahead and start a new app. So we'll start a new app just to illustrate that concept. Because I think, after looking at the project proposals, I think multiple projects in this class can also benefit from knowing how to do this. So I'll go ahead and just, make a project to illustrate it. Start a new project, and we'll just say, store records. All right, so we have store records here, and with this particular project, I would just have a few text boxes and something on the screen to represent the record, and a button to store, and another button to retrieve out of a list. So we'll go ahead and start with text boxes. There we go. So we'll have, let's say, 3 text boxes here. Depending on what you want to do, in this case, I don't really care what I'm doing, because it's just an example. And we'll drag one button here, and I'll also put a list picker. I'll explain what I'm doing with these things later. Button 1 is going to be renamed to button store. So this is the trigger to store a record into TinyDB, and I'll change the text accordingly. Go. All right. So what I'm storing is now using the first text box as the key or the tag of the TinyDB item, and then the value that I'm storing would come from these 2 text fields. I will make a list out of these 2 and store the list as the value associated with that tag. Is that okay? Okay. So we'll go ahead and write the code to do this. So we go to blocks, and we use the button. When the button is clicked, that's when something is going to be done. So what is going to be done? Oh, I forgot one important thing. I didn't put a TinyDB component into this name, so we have to drag a TinyDB component into here first, and we can do something about it. There we go. So when the button store is clicked, then what we'll do is we'll simply store the item. Okay. So we'll go to TinyDB 1. And just say store a value. So what we are going to store in this case, the tag is based on the first text box. So I go to text box 1 and retrieve its text and use it as the tag for this particular item.
That's the ID.
Right. That's basically the ID, exactly. It's the key. And then I'll go to list to make a single item out of 2 individual items, make it a list. So I will say make a new list out of those 2 items. So those 2 items, one comes from text box 2, the text field of text box 2, and the other one will come from text box 3, which I can just duplicate this one and just change which text box we're dealing with. So that's how we can store a record. Yours is probably a little bit more complex, but that's the idea. Okay, so we'll go ahead and try this one, and then I'll show you what the TinyDB is actually storing, by going into the console, to look at the file itself. So we'll go run the application and just say, this is key 1. So we'll say this is V1 K1. This is value 1 of key 1, and the other one is going to be value 2 for key 1, and then click store. Okay, nothing seems to happen because it's all happening in the background. So now I switch to my command line because I want to go in and see what is actually being stored. So I go to user, Google. This part is Unix specific. Yours is going to be slightly different. And then we want to run ADB, and I want to make sure the device is actually connected, which it is, and we'll start the shell. So once we get to the shell, the data is stored in /data, and then you have all these names here. App Inventor at this point, is not it's one of these two. Okay, because the other apps are not. It's not installed yet. Okay, this is still running as the AI companion, so I have to look for that one too. So we are dealing with EDU MIT App Inventor AI companion. So I'm just going to be lazy and copy and paste it. So copy and paste. There you go. And then within here we have files, and within files we have that's not the right one. Yep, there we go. I think that's the TinyDB here. So within shared prefs, we have tinydb1.xml. So when you look at tinydb1.xml, we'll see the actual things that it's stored. So it is basically, this is from another application that I was dealing with, but you can see that key 1, which is what I just entered, is the tag, and then the body is v1k1 and v2k1. Now all the ampersand quotes and stuff like that, that's just HTML encoding. And then the square bracket notation is the JSON encoding. It uses your square bracket to denote a list. So the beginning and the close of a list are square brackets. So this way we can verify the data is actually stored. So the next question is, if I store a few things like this, how do I know what I can retrieve, and if so, how do I retrieve it? So that's the next step. So let's go ahead and store key 2, because we want to make it a little bit more interesting. So we have value 1 of key 2, value 2 of key 2, store, and if I go back to the file, okay, if I just I cannot use the shortcut. I have to cat tinydb1.xml, and you can now see that key 2 is also stored. So basically tinydb is just that. It's a flat file that stores in XML format the encoding of using JSON of all the stuff that we want to store.
Just creates a spreadsheet. I mean,
it's basically just a lookup table. Okay, if you give me this key, I'll look up the value. Okay, all right. So now that we have this, okay, let's go back to the application right here and say, okay, now that we know that we have stored a few records, how do we know which records have been stored, and how do we retrieve those records? Okay, that would be kind of like a natural question. So that's why I have this list picker here. First thing is to change the list picker text here, and I'll just change it to retrieve. Okay, so this is for the retrieval. Okay, for the retrieval of the records that have been stored already. And then we go to the blocks. With a list picker, there are two events that are important. One is before picking, and the other one is after picking. The before picking event happens when someone is just clicking on the list picker, and then the after picking one is after something is chosen from the list. So I would handle the first one first, which is before picking. This is where I can populate the list picker. In other words, I will present choices. Okay, I'll find out what choices are applicable in this case and make it the content of this particular list picker. Now TinyDB has a really, really handy feature to do this. If you look into TinyDB, it has a call called getTags. Okay, what it does is it will retrieve, it will return a list of all the tags. So if you have stored, let's say 1,000 records into your TinyDB, this will become a list of 1,000 tags, or keys, if you will, of all the items. So that becomes very handy because this is already a list. Because I'm going to drag this one out. I cannot plug it in directly into list picker for the time being. But if you go to list picker 1, it also has a particular method to match the list coming back from TinyDB1. It is set list picker 1 dot elements. There we go. And what this block does is it will basically say, give me a list, and whatever is on that list becomes the elements of this particular list picker. and that's very handy. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do it just like that. Okay, now right now I'm not doing anything when something is picked, but I want to see whether this works or not. Okay, so it's a good idea to kind of test your program in stages. So we'll go ahead and test this program, and we'll click retrieve, and now it retrieved all the keys from that particular TinyDB, and it's alphabetically sorted. Now, if I click on one of these things, it's not going to do a single thing because I don't have an event handler for after picking. Okay, so that would be the next step, right? The next step is to go to a list picker and handle the second event, which is after picking. So the after picking is going to use whatever is picked to retrieve from the TinyDB and then put it into the text boxes. Okay. So with this one, we are gonna retrieve from TinyDB based on the item that we have just picked, and then we can populate the text boxes. Okay. So we can let's do local variables. So we'll go ahead and use a local variable and just say that's the result of the retrieval. So the result of the retrieval will be initialized by a TinyDB1 call to get a value based on the tag. Okay. The tag is going to be whatever the list picker is, whatever is selected in the list picker. So I go back to list picker 1 and go to whatever is being selected right now. So I think it's just called selection. Okay, selection index is 0. So this is not the index, this is the actual thing that is selected, which is the value, which is our tag. If tag is not there, it returns in this case an empty space. But because the list in the list picker is coming from TinyDB1, I'm getting a list of all the keys, this cannot possibly fail. Okay, if it fails, then we have a serious problem, because then the TinyDB1 or the function calls are not consistent within itself. So I'm not expecting to have to even use value if tag is not there. When it comes back, result will be initialized to the list that is being retrieved, and then now I can put those items into the list, into the text boxes. So right here, I would use text box 1, and set the value to the tag itself. So that would be setting the text of text box 1 to the same thing as what the list picker is selecting at this point. So I just put it here. And then we have text box 2, and then text box 3. I'm just going to duplicate this one to deal with text box 3. And right here, I'm not doing any error checking. In your code, you probably want to check and make sure that result is a list before you treat it as a list. But since I'm fairly sure this is going to work, at least for the items that I store, so we'll go ahead and go to lists here and say, give me a particular item in the list. So we'll say select list item based on the index. The list in this case is going to be result, because that is retrieved from TinyDB as a list. So we say that's a list, and the index of the first one is just 1. Okay, so we'll specify 1 and duplicate this block here and change the number or the index to 2 for the second one. Okay, so that should retrieve the record associated with that particular key. Okay, so that's my hope that it will do it. So let's go ahead and check it. So go back to the emulator. We have to reset the emulator again. If it doesn't crash so often, this is really an awesome tool.
Yeah.
But the crashing part has to do with the emulator, probably more so than App Inventor 2 itself. Oh, by the way, when I went to the district academic senate meeting, everybody almost everybody had an iPad with a keyboard.
Oh.
A few people brought along like regular desktop computers, which I think, not desktop, laptop computers, which I think is, it's okay.
Very dirty bring a lot of desktop.
And what did I bring? I brought along my trusty Nexus 5 and a Bluetooth keyboard. And with this one, I can prop it up. It has a little built-in stand. So I was using it as my little computer. I just put it up on the table, and then my keyboard is bigger, obviously, quite a bit bigger than my little computer here, and I was typing away just like everybody else, except mine doesn't have a big old apple in the back. I should probably make a little symbol, like an apple with a cross or something like that, just to make a point. All right, so we got our application here. We'll click retrieve, and it has it lists all the items. Test is probably not going to work because that is not a list. But if I click key 1, it repopulates all the text fields with the values coming back from the database, TinyDB. So is that going to help? Okay. All right, excellent. Go ahead.
How do you remove?
How do I remove 1? Oh, that's a good question. Let's see.
Get rid of key 1 and everything associated with it.
That is a good question. Let's find out. Okay, so everything that we can possibly do with TinyDB is listed here. So we have to see, well, we have clear tag. So if you want to get rid of everything that has to do with key 1, the value key 1 as a tag, you supply key 1 as the tag of this block, and then this block should clear that entire entry.
Simple enough.
That might be a clear all too. If there's there's a clear all, so you can reset the entire TinyDB to nothing without having to go through the items one by one. Okay. Any other questions? That's a very good question. Yep, go ahead.
One last thing. Instead of the key, when you do the list paper, would you come up with like the first item if it was the name instead?
I believe the key can be any string.
Well, I mean, can you choose to show the first field instead of the key?
Yes, that part is entirely up to you. What you want to do with the screen here is entirely up to you. So I make it so that it reflects, the key itself and then the 2 values. But if you don't want to do that, you can just completely get rid of the first one.
I'm talking about on the hit retrieve. Then it shows a list of keys. Can you make that show a different field?
Ooh, that one. You can, but then you have to work on it. Okay. I can show you exactly what I mean by that. We got about 5 minutes. That's enough time. Okay, so before picking, in this case, I'm really lazy because I just say, oh, whatever we have as a list of all the tags, just use that as the whatever I display in the list picker. Instead of doing that, you can do something a little bit more complicated. It's not really the end of the world, but it's just a little bit more complicated. App Inventor has a really cool feature in Control to help you out a lot with this already. So, and that feature has to go to Control and for each item in the list. So now you say for each item in the list, and that list is coming from TinyDB1 and get tags, and we can now get rid of this guy here. Then you can say pick the first item of the list of each thing and make that the selection key of the list picker. Now the problem with that is when the user selects a particular item, you no longer have access to the actual tag itself. You just have a part of the value associated with the tag. So you have 2 choices. You have 2 easy choices here. One is to make this list so that it is a 1-to-1 correspondence to the get tags list. So you can use the index number in this case to go to the get tags list and retrieve the actual key, and then once you have the key, you can retrieve the rest of the item. So that would be the easiest way to do it. But that also means that you may not be displaying the keys in a sorted way. So you might run into a few problems here because if two items have the same value component that is exactly the same, then you end up with two identical items on your list picker, and then you won't be able to tell which one is which one. Is that okay? Yeah. Any other questions related to list pickers or TinyDB? No questions? Okay. All right. If there are no questions, we have about 3 more minutes to go. What do you guys want to talk about? Oh, the regulation and the policy. Anything else? Yep, go ahead.
When you have a second screen, you can still access TinyDB.
Yes. All screens of the same application refer to the same TinyDB. So the file name does say it is TinyDB1, so I'm not sure whether you have to name it as TinyDB1. That part I am not 100% sure. Okay, because when you look at the file name, I think I got out. Yeah, I got kicked out of it. Okay, so let's go back to that again. Do this. Okay, so when you look at this, it is tinydb1.xml. If you use tinydb1 as the name of the component in the other screen, for sure you will be able to retrieve the same items. It will be using the same tinydb. Now, if you use a different name, I'm not sure about that. Yep.
Theoretically, could you download the AIA, unzip it, and then load the TinyDB from the file, and then rezip it and upload it? Would it?
So you have a default TinyDB.
Basically, download it and load it. Instead of doing it through the interface, manually enter everything in and then re-upload.
That is a good question. I'm not sure whether the TinyDB XML file is a part of the AIA file. That's the thing. It may not be a part of it. So you might end up having to do this instead. So you might have to end up doing a screen one, and when it is initialized, you might need to put in some logic here to see if TinyDB1 is already initialized. If not, then you have a section of code just to initialize all the default entries in TinyDB1.
Right. Let's try it. Let's see what happens. We got a few minutes. Let's try it. See what
To
happens.
do what? Try what?
Downloading .aia of it.
I have some already.
That with the TinyDB.
Okay.
And then seeing if we enter information in and then rezip it and upload it, will App Inventor recognize it and load up everything appropriately?
Okay.
Or will it just be corrupted?
Sure. We can just use this one, right? This one definitely has a TinyDB. So we go to My Projects, and this is Store Records. Export to my computer. Store records.aia. So, yep. Okay, so we can just unzip store records.aia, and it does not have a default file for TinyDB1. Once you download it as an APK file, you might have a file structure that can contain a default TinyDB file.
Okay.
But then you have to use APK tools to disassemble and then reassemble the whole thing.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out if there was an easier way than trying to load it up through the interface because that one, when you're trying to load up a large quantity of things.
Yep. Yeah, you might still have to go through your code to do it. I would just make a subroutine to do it.
It might initialize, yeah.
There's nothing here.
Couldn't see with the downward angle from up here.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find a better way because I have a lot of ones that I gotta load up for it.
Right. Yeah, I don't know of any